When a billionaire CEO loses $4.2 billion overnight, only a single dad running a coffee cart possesses the hidden genius to save her fortune and teach her what wealth truly means. The numbers on Catherine Williams's phone screen blurred together as she stumbled through Manhattan's empty streets, barefoot and drunk on expensive scotch. Her $12,000 Versace dress was torn at the hem where she'd caught it on her office door, her carefully constructed image shattered like the crystal champagne flute she'd thrown against her penthouse window 3 hours earlier. Williams Technologies, her quantum computing empire, had lost 87% of its value in just 6 trading hours. Black Monday 2.0, the financial networks were calling it, their talking heads dissecting her failure with gleeful precision. The AI algorithms had turned on themselves like rabid dogs, creating a cascading death spiral that swallowed everything she'd built over 15 brutal years of clawing her way up from nothing. By midnight, Catherine had received 47 margin calls from panicked creditors, 12 resignation letters from board members abandoning the sinking ship, 3 offers from vulture capitalists wanting to pick her corpse clean, and 1 devastating text from her lead attorney that made her blood run cold. "We need to talk about bankruptcy protection immediately. Personal liability exceeds $4.2 billion. $4.2 billion. Money she didn't have. Money that would crush her completely. The SEC would come for her with investigations and insider trading allegations. The shareholders would file lawsuits that would drag on for years. The media would feast on her corpse, dissecting every decision she'd ever made, painting her as another greedy executive who flew too close to the sun. Everything she'd built from absolutely nothing would be remembered only as a cautionary tale. She'd started with nothing. A foster care kid bounced between 12 homes before aging out of the system at 18, sleeping in her car while attending community college, teaching herself to code in public libraries, building her first startup in a shared apartment with 4 roommates and surviving on ramen noodles and ambition. By 35, she was a billionaire, featured on magazine covers, keynoting conferences, proving that the scared little girl who'd never had a real family could build an empire that made the world pay attention. And now it was gone, evaporated like morning mist, leaving only debts and recriminations and the hollow echo of her footsteps on empty pavement. Catherine found herself walking with no destination in mind, just movement to outrun the panic clawing at her chest, the voice in her head whispering that she should have seen this coming, should have hedged better, should have listened to the executive she'd fired for questioning her aggressive expansion strategy. Her feet were bleeding from broken glass she'd stepped over somewhere near Wall Street, but she barely felt it. The physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of watching everything collapse in real time, powerless to stop it, drowning in the wreckage of her own hubris. At 3:17 in the morning, she stopped at a humble coffee cart glowing under a streetlight in the financial district, drawn by the simple human need for something warm, something real, something that made sense in a world that had just stopped making sense entirely. A handsome but tired-looking man in his late 30s stood behind the counter, wiping it down with methodical care. He had kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that suggested he'd seen his share of 3 a.m. desperation. He looked up as she approached, taking in her disheveled appearance, her bare feet, her smudged mascara and torn designer dress, and asked simply, without recognition or judgment or the pitying condescension she'd expected, "Rough night?" Catherine laughed, a bitter sound that came out more like a sob. "You could say that." He poured her a cup of black coffee, the steam rising between them like a peace offering, and said quietly, $3. She'd lost billions in a single day, watched her entire world crumble, faced personal ruin that would destroy her completely. But somehow, that simple transaction, paying $3 for coffee like a normal person, like someone who still belonged in the world, made her want to cry for the first time since the markets had opened that terrible morning. James Mitchell had recognized Catherine Williams the moment she approached his cart, though he'd never let on, treating her with the same quiet courtesy he showed every broken soul who wandered to his corner at 3 in the morning. He'd been tracking Williams Technology stock for 8 months, watching its meteoric rise with growing concern, filling page after page of his worn leather notebook with financial models and predictive algorithms he worked on during slow hours between serving coffee to Wall Street's insomniacs and night shift workers. His analysis had predicted exactly this crash, down to the approximate timing and the catastrophic cascade effect. But who would listen to a coffee cart operator about complex market dynamics? He'd left Goldman Sachs 3 years ago when his wife Rebecca got cancer, choosing his daughters Grace and Sophie over his career, walking away from a partnership track and $500,000 a year because some things mattered more than money, more than prestige, more than proving he was the smartest person in every room. Now he worked 10 at night until 6 in the morning so he could be there when his daughters woke up each morning, walk Grace to school, help Sophie with her homework, be the father they needed after losing their mother to a disease that had stolen her slowly, painfully, giving them just enough time to say goodbye, but not nearly enough time to prepare for the emptiness she'd leave behind. As Catherine sipped her coffee with shaking hands, she started talking, the alcohol and darkness and devastating loneliness loosening her tongue in a way the boardroom never had. She told him everything with the desperate honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. The over-leveraged positions she'd taken betting on continued growth, the margin calls flooding in from creditors who'd been happy to enable her expansion when times were good, but were now circling like sharks smelling blood in the water. The $4.2 billion in personal liability that would destroy her completely, the lawsuits that would bury her under legal fees and public humiliation for years to come. James listened carefully, his analytical mind already sorting through the variables and possibilities, and then he asked a question that made her freeze mid-sentence, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. Did you hedge your quantum computing patents separately from the stock, or are they tied up in the corporate structure? Her eyes widened with shock and confusion, this stranger cutting through to the heart of her financial complexity with surgical precision. "How do you possibly know about—" she started, but he interrupted gently. "Because if you hedged them separately, you've got leverage with your creditors, real assets they can't touch in bankruptcy proceedings. And if you've got 72 hours before the margin calls turn into forced liquidations and the real damage locks in permanently, you can still pivot, still save the core of what you built even if the stock price never recovers." For the next hour, this humble coffee cart stranger asked questions that cut deeper than any consultant she'd ever paid 6 figures per hour, understanding derivatives and patent valuations and creditor hierarchies and restructuring strategies better than her own chief financial officer, seeing angles and opportunities she'd missed in her panic, treating her $4 billion disaster like a complex puzzle that could still be solved if she moved the right pieces in the right order. James pulled out his worn notebook, showing her pages filled with dense financial analysis and predictive models that would have impressed her top executives, explaining how he'd seen this crash coming months ago, how the AI trading algorithms had created a feedback loop that was always going to end in catastrophe, how the smartest move now wasn't trying to save her stock price, but salvaging the underlying technology and intellectual property that still had enormous value. "Who are you?" Catherine whispered finally, looking at this man who served coffee from a cart but thought like the most brilliant strategist she'd ever encountered. James smiled sadly, closing his notebook and meeting her eyes with an honesty that made her chest ache. "Someone who used to do this for a living, before life taught me that being smart about money matters a lot less than being present for the people you love. I'm James Mitchell, and I think I can help you, but first, you need to tell me if you're ready to rebuild everything differently than you built it the first time." Catherine showed up at James's cart the next night, sober, desperate, and carrying a laptop that contained the wreckage of her empire in spreadsheets and legal documents that read like an autopsy report on her ambitions. She'd spent the day in emergency meetings with lawyers and accountants who'd presented her with 2 options: declare bankruptcy immediately and try to protect whatever scraps remained, or fight a losing battle that would drain her completely and leave her with nothing but debt and humiliation. Neither option was acceptable, which is why she'd come back to this coffee cart and this stranger who'd seen possibilities in her disaster that seasoned professionals had missed entirely. "I need your help," she said bluntly, her voice stripped of the commanding authority that had once made board members tremble, replaced by raw vulnerability that felt like standing naked in Times Square. "I'll pay you whatever you want, give you equity, make you a partner, anything." James looked at her carefully while preparing coffee for a construction worker who'd stopped by on his way to an early shift, and said quietly, "I don't want your money, Catherine, but I do have conditions that aren't negotiable." Over coffee and bagels from a nearby deli, they negotiated terms that would have seemed insane 48 hours earlier, when Catherine Williams still believed she was untouchable. James would help her save Williams Technologies, devoting his analytical mind and strategic brilliance to her crisis, but only if she rebuilt the company differently than she'd constructed it the first time, with genuine integrity instead of ruthless ambition, with employee profit sharing instead of executive bonuses, with sustainable growth instead of the aggressive expansion that had created this catastrophe, with a commitment to treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Catherine, who'd built her reputation on crushing competitors without mercy and firing anyone who questioned her vision, bristled at these conditions initially, her pride rebelling against accepting lectures about ethics from a coffee cart operator. But she was completely out of options, backed into a corner with 72 hours before her creditors forced liquidation, and she knew with absolute certainty that James Mitchell understood financial warfare better than anyone else she could possibly find in time. They worked through the night, James's worn notebook transforming into a detailed battle plan that was audacious, risky, and just crazy enough to work if they executed perfectly. First priority, liquidate everything personal immediately, converting assets to cash before creditors could freeze them in legal proceedings. The penthouse overlooking Central Park, the contemporary art collection she'd assembled to prove she belonged among the elite, the yacht she'd never actually had time to enjoy, all of it went up for sale within 48 hours at devastating discounts that made her want to weep, but generated the immediate liquidity she desperately needed. Second, use James's sophisticated crash analysis to identify which technology sectors would recover first from the market collapse and strategically reposition her remaining assets to capture that rebound, essentially making calculated bets that her company's quantum computing applications would be essential to the recovery itself. Third, and most painful, Catherine would go public with complete humility, admitting her mistakes in a press conference that would make her vulnerable to mockery and attack, taking a $1 annual salary, sleeping in her office instead of luxury hotels, demonstrating through actions rather than words that she was committed to saving her company and her employees rather than her personal fortune. The media would absolutely savage her for this display, calling it a publicity stunt or desperate theater. But creditors might give her breathing room if they believed she was genuinely committed to restructuring rather than hiding assets and preparing to run. James worked from the cart while Catherine executed their plan from her phone and laptop, his daughters asleep in the small apartment above his workspace where he'd raised them alone after Rebecca died, creating a life of modest stability that now seemed infinitely more valuable than the billions she'd lost. At 4 in the morning, James's 9-year-old daughter Grace wandered down in her frozen pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and asking with a child's directness, "Daddy, why are you helping that mean lady from TV?" James knelt down to her level, brushing hair from her face with infinite gentleness, and said words that made Catherine's carefully constructed walls crack open. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, sweetheart, even people who forgot how to be kind." By day 3, Catherine's transformation shocked Wall Street with the force of a second earthquake, dominating financial news cycles as analysts struggled to understand what was happening to the Ice Queen who'd built her reputation on ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for weakness. The woman who'd fired executives without blinking, who'd crushed competitors and intimidated board members with her brilliance and her contempt for anyone who couldn't keep pace with her vision, was now sleeping on her office couch, selling her possessions in fire sales that generated millions of dollars in immediate cash, and admitting mistakes publicly in interviews that made her former allies uncomfortable with their raw honesty. But the real earthquake, the moment that changed everything and burned every bridge she'd carefully constructed over 15 years of climbing, came when she brought James Mitchell to the emergency shareholder meeting as her strategic consultant, walking into that boardroom with a coffee cart operator whose quiet confidence radiated more authority than all her expensive credentials and magazine covers combined. The board members stared at this unassuming man in a simple button-down shirt and khakis as he calmly dismantled their recovery plan in 10 minutes flat, his analysis cutting through their elaborate presentations and consultant reports like a surgeon's scalpel through infected tissue. "You're trying to save the stock price," James said evenly, his voice carrying none of Catherine's former aggression but somehow commanding absolute attention. "But the stock is already dead, and trying to resurrect it is throwing good money after bad. Save the company instead. Focus on what actually has value. Patent the quantum algorithms separately, license them to other technology companies, build sustainable revenue streams from intellectual property while you restructure the corporate debt. You're sitting on technology worth billions of dollars in real value, but you're so obsessed with market capitalization and stock performance that you can't see the actual assets right in front of you." He pulled out his notebook, showing them projections and licensing models and recovery scenarios that were more sophisticated than anything their paid consultants had produced, speaking their language perfectly but coming to completely different conclusions about what mattered and what didn't. The silence that followed was deafening, tension crackling through the mahogany-paneled boardroom like electricity before a lightning strike. And then the lead board member exploded with indignation and barely controlled rage. "Who the hell is this guy?" he demanded, his face turning red as he pointed at James dismissively. "A coffee cart owner is giving us financial advice? This is insane, Catherine. You've lost your mind along with your fortune." Catherine stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height, and felt something shift inside her chest, some final tether to her old life snapping cleanly. "He's the only person who predicted this crash when all of you were congratulating me on our stock performance," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He's the only person who's been right about everything that's happened, and he's the only person I trust to tell me the truth instead of what I want to hear." She paused, looking around the table at men who'd enabled her worst impulses because it benefited them financially. "I'm restructuring this company with or without this board's support. Anyone who can't accept that reality is welcome to resign immediately, and I'll have your severance packages prepared by end of business today." 3 board members stood up and walked out, their expensive shoes clicking against marble floors in a rhythm that sounded like the death march of her old life, muttering about lawsuits and fiduciary duty and betrayal. But 5 stayed, looking uncertain and uncomfortable but willing to see where this unprecedented crisis would lead. That night, Catherine showed up in James's cart looking shaken to her core, her hands trembling as she gripped a coffee cup for warmth against the cold October wind. "I just burned every bridge I had in corporate America," she said quietly, the reality of what she'd done finally hitting her with devastating force. "Everyone I've worked with for 15 years now thinks I've lost my mind. My reputation is destroyed." James poured her coffee and met her eyes with understanding that came from someone who'd made his own impossible choice years earlier. "No," he said gently but firmly, "you just stopped pretending to be someone you're not. Stopped playing a game that was destroying you from the inside. That's not losing your mind, Catherine, that's finding it again. But now, I need you to answer something honestly. Why did you really come back tonight? What are you actually afraid of?" James was quiet for a long moment, steam rising from the espresso machine between them, while early morning traffic began its distant rumble through Manhattan's streets. And Catherine realized she was holding her breath waiting for his answer to a question she hadn't quite managed to articulate. 3 years ago, my wife Rebecca was dying from stage 4 pancreatic cancer," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of grief that time had softened but never fully erased. "I was making $500,000 a year at Goldman Sachs, on track for partner before 40, managing a portfolio worth billions, getting headhunted by every major firm on Wall Street. But Rebecca was dying, and she needed me, not my money, not the best medical care I could buy, not nurses or assistants or any of the things my salary could provide. She needed her husband present and conscious and there, really there, not checking his phone during chemo appointments or taking calls during her worst moments." He smiled sadly, looking past Catherine toward memories that still had power to break his heart. "Grace was 6 years old, and terrified of losing her mother. Sophie was just 3, too young to understand why Mommy was always sick and tired. Everyone told me I was throwing my career away, that I could hire the best help money could buy, that Rebecca would want me to think about our financial future. But Rebecca didn't need an employee. She needed the man she married. So I walked away from everything I'd built. Catherine felt tears threatening, her throat tight with emotion she usually kept locked away behind walls of anger and ambition. And she understood suddenly why this man's kindness felt so foreign and threatening, because it exposed everything hollow about the life she'd constructed. After she died, James continued, pulling out his worn notebook and running his fingers across its leather cover like a talisman, I couldn't go back to that world, couldn't pretend those numbers on screens mattered more than actual human lives, couldn't participate in a game where winning meant destroying people's retirements and jobs and futures in pursuit of quarterly earnings targets. So I opened this cart and named it after Rebecca, because she always loved good coffee, loved the ritual of it, the simple pleasure of a perfect cup shared with someone you care about. He showed Catherine the notebook, pages filled with brilliant market analysis done between serving construction workers and taxi drivers and insomniacs, his genius still functioning at full capacity, but deployed differently now. I kept analyzing markets because I can't stop my brain from working, can't turn off the part of me that sees patterns and predicts outcomes and understands how all these systems connect. But I also kept serving coffee because it reminds me every single day what actually matters in this world. My daughters wake up every morning with me there making them breakfast. I walk Grace to school and hear about her day. I help Sophie with homework and read them bedtime stories. I'm not wasting my talents or hiding from my potential. I'm using them for something real, something that won't disappear when markets crash or algorithms fail or the next crisis hits. Catherine understood then with painful clarity what she'd sacrificed to build her empire, the human connection she'd dismissed as weakness, the vulnerability she'd armored against until she'd become invincible and completely alone. I grew up in foster care, she admitted, the words coming hard because she'd spent years hiding this part of her history, pretending she'd sprung fully formed into the world without past or weakness. Bounced between 12 different homes before aging out of the system at 18. Some were okay, some were nightmares I still dream about. I built Williams Technologies because I swore I'd never be powerless again, never be dependent on anyone's charity or kindness, never be that scared little girl waiting to be abandoned. Her voice cracked slightly. But I became so powerful that I forgot how to be human. I have no family, no real friends, just employees who fear me, and competitors who hate me, and board members who tolerate me as long as I'm making them money. I built a $4 billion empire, and I have absolutely no one to share it with. James reached across the cart and squeezed her hand with a gentleness that made her want to sob, his calloused fingers warm against her skin, and said words that changed everything. Then let's build something different together, not just a company, but a life worth living. Sound like a plan?
6 months later, Williams Technologies looked nothing like its former self, and everything like something better. Something sustainable and human, and actually worth building. The Wall Street analysts still debated whether Catherine Williams had lost her mind or discovered something they were too cynical to understand. The stock had recovered to 40% of its peak value, which the financial press called disappointing until they looked deeper and realized the company was now genuinely profitable rather than propped up by speculation and leverage. Growing steadily rather than chasing unsustainable expansion, creating real value rather than manipulating quarterly earnings reports to satisfy impatient investors. Catherine had restructured completely with employee profit sharing that made even junior engineers stakeholders in the company's success, established mentorship programs for foster youth interested in STEM careers, funded scholarships that gave kids like her younger self a chance at education without crushing debt, and created a company culture built on innovation and collaboration rather than fear and competition. James worked as Chief Strategy Officer remotely, contributing his brilliant analysis and strategic vision while still running the coffee cart on weekends because it kept him grounded, reminded him where he'd been and what mattered, gave him a connection to the real world that executive suites and board meetings could never provide. But more importantly than stock prices or profit margins or any metric Wall Street cared about, Lives had fundamentally changed in ways that couldn't be quantified on spreadsheets or quarterly reports. Catherine was no longer the ice queen, no longer the ruthless executive who'd sacrificed everything human for success, but instead had become Aunt Catherine to Grace and Sophie, teaching them coding on Saturday mornings at the coffee cart, attending their school plays and soccer games, learning what family actually meant when it wasn't transactional or conditional or based on what you could provide. She'd bought a modest apartment 3 blocks from James's place instead of another penthouse, choosing proximity to people she loved over status and square footage, discovering that Sunday morning pancakes with 2 little girls who called her family felt better than any magazine cover or keynote speech ever had. James had forgiven himself for stepping back from high finance, realizing he'd never actually left the game, but had simply found a better way to use his gifts, proving that brilliance deployed with purpose and humanity created more value than genius deployed for profit alone. Together, they'd shown that empires built on compassion and genuine care for employees could be stronger and more resilient than those built on fear and exploitation. On a sunny Saturday morning in April, Catherine sat at the coffee cart wearing jeans and a simple sweater, no longer hiding who she was, but no longer needing to prove anything either, simply being present in a moment that 6 months ago she couldn't have imagined wanting. Grace and Sophie ran up with a tablet, excitement radiating from them like sunlight, showing her their latest app prototype with pride that made her chest ache with unexpected joy. "We made a program that predicts coffee sales based on weather and time and day of the week," Sophie announced, bouncing on her toes. "Daddy says it's really sophisticated for our age." James smiled at Catherine over their heads, that quiet smile that still made her feel seen in ways she'd never experienced before, and she smiled back with gratitude for the second chance she'd never thought she deserved. "You know what's funny?" Catherine said, watching the girls explain their algorithm with infectious enthusiasm, sipping coffee that tasted better than anything her former life had offered. "I spent 20 years building a $4 billion fortune, convinced that money and power would make me invincible and important and worthy of respect." She gestured at the cart, the girls, James, the simple, ordinary, beautiful moment they were sharing. "But this right here, this is the first time in my entire life I've ever actually been rich, the first time I've understood what wealth really means. It's not what you own or control or dominate. It's who chooses to stand beside you when everything else falls apart, who sees you at your worst and decides you're worth rebuilding, who teaches you that being human is stronger than being powerful." James took her hand as the girls continued their excited chatter, and Catherine Williams, former Billionaire CEO, discovered that losing everything had been the greatest gift she'd ever received.
Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more inspiring tales of resilience, second chances, and the extraordinary connections that change lives forever.